Spell explanations. Spells, special commentary for refereeing. Some consideration, as well as practicality, make it impossible to give a concise list of each spell herein, with name, level, range, duration, area of effect, and so forth, tabulated and then special notes appended. A playing aid of this sort will likely be done in the not-too-distant future, and that will serve your needs far better than a spread herein. There are, however, quite a number of special notes which you must be apprised of, as spells are often abused by players. The type of magic is given in the player's handbook in order that you may creatively develop material regarding spells, new spells, spell components, spell formulae, or even limitations due to magical repression or other reasons on certain types of spells in some areas. Likewise, specialists can be developed as non-player characters, basing their abilities around the type of magic involved. In short, the type of magic involved in the casting of each spell is there to give you flexibility and a foundation for creativity. Spell components for a spell are generally lost/used when the spell is cast. Exceptions: holy/unholy symbols, druid's mistletoe, et al. Commentary regarding certain spells follows. Be certain to read all of the material and have it at hand whenever a spell user casts a spell for which special considerations are noted. And that is from page 41 of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, written by Gary Gygax and friends. Along with me to discuss it today is the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Scott Bruner.
Good morning, everyone.
I am historian, gadfly, man about town, Ben Riggs, and I am fascinated by this section because I just grabbed my first edition player's handbook, and it has the spells in there. This is just like notes for the DM on the spells, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that's really cool about the Advanced D&D Dungeon Master's Guide is how much is literally like footnotes for the player's handbook, right? It's like, it's viewing all of those rules. I would say the player's handbook is more kind of a mechanical thing, which is like, ooh, here's how you build a character, where the DM's guide is like fleshing out the aesthetics and the theme, and of course how you're going to educate each of these, whether it's spells or it's parasitic contraction. It's very much, it feels like it's like it's the prairie home companion to the player's handbook, if you will. Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's funny because I'm sitting here and I'm like, ooh, I've never really read the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. I was going to say has anyone, but that's just rude. I'm sure there's many people out there that have. I mean, I use it as a reference tome from time to time, and I know that one of the largest criticisms of 5th edition, and one of the things that's going to happen in Dungeons and Dragons 2024?
D&D 2024?
That's what we're calling it. All right.
That's Mike Shea's idea, and it's a great idea.
Yeah, is that they're trying... Well, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of news is coming out, of course, about the 5th edition of books. The whole concept is that the new books are going to be... Wow, I don't want to digress already, but one of the things is, of course, is that the new books are going to be specifically designed so that people can jump into the hobby, so that somebody who's never played Dungeons & Dragons can pick up the D&D 24 Player's Handbook and DM's Guide and roll with it. And I was going to say that one of the criticisms of the 5th edition DM's Guide is that you cannot read it and you're still going to be fine running a game, right? I've never actually read it. I've skimmed through parts. I've used it for stat blocks here and there. But the reason I'm thinking about that is I don't know if the 5th edition DM's Guide has a section, but I don't think it does, where it goes through every individual spell specifically, or at least the ones that could potentially cause problems or that you want to think about. Because I think that's actually a fascinating thing. I think that this is going to be a rather useful section. I think it's really interesting to go, like, especially while talking about D&D 2024, this concept of new people coming into the hobby. My gosh, you and I have, been running tabletop role-playing games for a really long time, so we know how people can abuse specific spells. We know kind of what to look for, but somebody coming new into it can read spells and not going to know how people might abuse it, or like how exactly it works, or what the mechanics behind it are, which is both good and bad. I think it's I mean, one of my favorite stories ever, sorry, I'm kind of going off here. One of my favorite stories ever is I remember when we were playing, we was like 15 years old, and folks would always cast Summon Monster, but they would always cast Summon Monster like in the the air. So the monster, they would basically, instead of having the monster attack whatever they were fighting, they would use them as basically, falling cannonballs. And I remember we allowed that back in the day, but I think there's now it's a rule they could only come on the ground. But yeah, I think this is great to go through individual spells. I think it's cool. I think fifth edition should have done it, but maybe it did because I don't know.
So I guess we should throw out that we are recording this on June 23rd, and again, I'm not a huge social media guy, but man, when I have been on this week, it seems like it's been a parade of people complaining about everything about D&D 2024 months before an actual book is released. And a lot of it has just been people freaking out about the art, which
Yeah,
at some point, like some of the art I've liked, some of it I haven't. I don't know, man. Like
it's
maybe if you're really like, how much can we freak out about the images of the orcs? The images of the orcs came out this week. Did you
Ben.
see the images of the orcs?
No, I didn't, and I'm going to look it up. It's funny. It's funny to me. I think one of the things complimentary about this channel is about how you and I are completely on different social media channels because I haven't heard any of this. I mean, a few peeps from some of my players in the Discord channels, but I'm going to look up orcs while I talk about this. But I think it's funny that you're saying, how could people get so upset about a role-playing game, but we're literally in the middle of a podcast where we spend an hour reading rules directly and commenting on them. I mean, there's nothing about like it's just people take this stuff so
Yeah.
unbelievably
Well,
seriously.
again, I am pro people taking it seriously, and I'm even
Yeah.
kind of pro people getting upset about things.
Hmm.
It just seems like the level of upset, like so the orcs. One person said they look more like half orcs.
Hmm.
Another person said, they don't look like monsters, which is also, I think, true. But I think that the image captures a change that has happened in the fandom, which is that people want orcs as playable characters and they enjoy the idea of playing an orc. And a lot of the like othering monster code in the art has gone away, at least in this one image has gone away. And I don't know, it just again the level of upset really surprised me. But
Yes,
now,
of course.
yeah, so but yeah, you're right. It's D&D, so I suppose nothing much to say. Did you find
Uh,
the art? Should I show you?
no, can you? I'm looking at something. I see Tasha around a cauldron. I'm seeing. I think that's. I hope that's not an orc, but it looks like some kind of dwarven fighter with a shield. Um, you were saying something
Ooh,
that I
D&D
would. I
orc
think I
art.
just think fifth edition D&D is in such a hard place, which is like, how do you have two very, very different audiences? I mean, the rhetorical messages that you're sending in the rule books is just going to be so tough. And in many ways, man, maybe stay, I don't know, like the whole concept to do it at D&D 2024. I mean, I know commercially why you have to do it, but you've got these two audiences. You've got the one audience of kind of the older grognards who really wants Dungeons and Dragons to still at least maintain some nod to the classic sword and sorcery, uncanny, grim dark setting. I should say grim dark isn't quite it, but you know what I mean. That kind of OSR feel.
Yeah,
And then of course what I mean D&D's. My gosh, I mean, you're the historian. I mean, reading your book, reading Game Wizards by John Peterson, it's just this, it is so unbelievable how we're in 2024 and it's still this concept of like, how are we going to sell this to new folks? Every new innovation from TSR to Wizards of the Coast has always been about we've got to bring new people into this hobby. And so they've also got an audience of like, how do we make this game as accessible as possible? I was interviewed by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Alumni Association because it's the 50th anniversary of D&D. I think there's no one on this podcast that didn't know that. And they were reaching out to anyone who had ever done any tabletop role-playing game work at DWM. They're talking to Jim Louder as well, which I thought was fantastic. And because he's also another Go Panther.
woo.
Panthers. Well, my point was one of the questions that the woman asked me when she was interviewing me was, how do people, if people hear, if people read this interview, how do you get them into Dungeons and Dragons? What's their next thing to do? And I was like, well, really, Dungeons and Dragons is such a strange little artifact, such a strange little game. The best way to do it, obviously, is to join a game, right? You've got to find people that already know how to play. And I'm sitting there being like, I'm saying exactly what the designers and the publishers of Dungeons and Dragons have never wanted me to say since 1977. Well, that's not 77, man. They were well aware back then that you couldn't play it with just the OD&D books. But you get my point. They've always been trying to make an edition of Dungeons and Dragons. It was the whole concept behind basic D&D, where somebody can just pick it up and play. Well, people will get it. And I don't know what your experience is when you were a kid. I always talk about, yeah, I've been playing for a long time, but I will never forget when I got my first Tom Moldvay box set and opened it up and read the rules, and I was so excited. And I tried to get my dad to run a game, and he's like, I don't know what any of this stuff means, and it's like, it's sad. I mean, I would read the book, I would read the monsters, I would memorize how to make a character, I would make characters up the wazoo. But before I actually found a game, of course, it took finding another, enough 11-year-olds. And well, what it took eventually is, I'm sure many people have this exact same experience. It made us, so we were 11, it made us finding that one 14 or 15-year-old who knew actually how to play it, and he would run the game, right? But anyway, my point was there's two audiences, and I think the art has to think about that as well, right? And the concepts of fantasy in modern day are very different than what the concepts of fantasy were in the 1970s. And I'm gonna make one I'm gonna make one little provocative statement here. I definitely like the fantasy of the 1970s better.
So, also this week, the D&D's new cosmology was essentially announced. And you have a sigil in the middle, surrounded by the Outlands, and all these other realms kind of surrounding it like a big donut. And I myself do not have any strong feelings about a change to D&D cosmology. But I also was listening to Jeremy Crawford talk about all the changes to the fighter class. Here's a 25-minute video on changes to the fighter class in the upcoming edition. And again, I don't have any strong attachment to the fighter class in 5th edition, but these two things triggered something in me, because I'm like, wow, again, this is sounding more, to me, it sounds more like an edition change for all of the ways they don't want to say that. Like, it sounds like they're making changes with a capital C. Maybe it's gonna, I know they want it to be backwards compatible, and in general, I've tried not to comment too much on what's coming up, because I like to see a product before I say anything about it. But my friends, I cannot help but think about Rob Hainso in 4th edition, who we had on the show a few weeks ago. And when I was interviewing him about 4th edition, and we were talking about the reception of the game by the fans, one of the things that he said he really took away from it was, man, we did a major evolution of the rules, and we also did a ton of things with the setting. If you're familiar with 4th edition, they radically changed the Forgotten Realms, and I just can't help but be like, hey, guys, like, maybe you're changing this more than you should. Maybe this, like, if you're going to do all these rules changes and you're changing the D&D cosmology, maybe this is going to be a swallow. Like, because again, it's not just the grognards that are going to be, wait, there's substantial changes to the fighter class. And again, a lot of the people under 30 that play that I talk to, like, they have attachments to the D&D cosmology. This is not a like exclusively I played in the 1970s with the white box issue. So again, this is just me off the cuff reacting to stuff on the internet, and I guess I'm not going to say anything else about it, because that's the one thing I had to say, and I'm going to go back to reading these spells.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get that out there since I have a podcast and people listen.
Yeah, people out there have to listen that way. I thought one thing, I think, before we move back, and I think we should, is Greyhawk is now the default setting for Dungeons and Dragons. Am I correct in saying
that is my understanding?
Like, you talk about the cosmology and getting people a little upset. Like, I don't. Again, it's interesting. I haven't been following this really, certainly not as closely as you have, which is interesting. Maybe I should be, but why? Do you know why they're going back to Greyhawk? Like, I mean, Forgotten Realms, like, everybody knows it so well. We just had how many years of adventures from, Descent into Avernus that had, like, far-reaching implications for not only the sociology, but also the literal geography of Faerun. And now we're going back to Greyhawk, a world which I love. I mean, I love Greyhawk, right? I'm a Gary Gygax fanatic, but at the same time, it seems like a strange decision. Do you have any
I have no
insight?
answer. I have
Yeah,
no
okay.
answer to
Yeah.
why, but again, I will tell you, like, man, Rob Hainsow's warning really rings loud in my head
Right.
here.
Yeah.
Like, and again, I don't have the finished product. It's the acme of foolishness, and yet what the internet is for, to comment extensively on a product that none of us will see for months. But,
And
but,
that's not that. What, 2 months, right? The first one
um,
comes out in September?
oh God, it's only 2 months till September, but
Well,
yes.
okay, it's June. I was
Um,
looking at the time. It's
still,
not July 22nd, it's June
yeah,
23rd. But yeah, that's still, I mean, that's coming up. And then of course they're all going to be staggered, which I find kind of interesting as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Um,
But like, if they were hiring me as a consultant, I would say you have the most successful version of your game ever. You need to be really fragile with this. Um, and again, like, the instinct of a designer is always to tinker and add
oh
because
yeah, yeah.
designers design.
Yep.
And yet, perhaps the best thing a designer can do is inspire and walk away. Um, I and again, hopefully, because I wish everyone in the fan community and everyone designing the game nothing but the best, and I would like this to be the more successful than 5e. I would love it if that happened. Um, but man, like, so okay, I get into trouble like talking about the future, but here we go. So you had 5e, the most successful version of D&D ever. OGL comes, Crisis comes along. All of these companies are like, I'm abandoning 5e. If this is as substantial a change as it is appearing to be, it would suggest that even Wizards of the Coast is essentially leaving uh, D&D 5e. And if people don't like it, it puts Cobalt Press in the Paizo situation of like, hey, we basically have 5e. As a matter of the game that we put out, Tales of the Valiant, was really dinged for being so incredibly close to 5e. You like 5e? You don't want to have to change? Come on over to Cobalt Press. So again, I don't, and a lot of for all of the attention I got for being like the golden age of role playing games is dead. Uh, One of the things I said would somewhat invalidate that prediction. I shouldn't say somewhat. I said it would invalidate that prediction. Would be if there was an OGL for the upcoming edition. And the upcoming edition is going to be in the Creative Commons apparently. So it would seem that that prediction should be invalidated, and things are too weird and different for that to be truly valid. Although I have to give an hour presentation on it at Gen Con, so so we'll see what I say.
Can
um
I ask you a question?
the last concluding thought. But if everyone is walking away from 5e, uh which it seems like maybe is happening, it's an opportunity for Kobold, and it's an abandonment of the largest player base D&D has ever had. Scott.
No, I'm sorry. I think I might have finally found real time. This is real time internet searching. I think I found the orc image. Is this the one where there's like a little kid orc and he's got what looks like a
And there's
uh,
kind of a matronly
it,
orc, and I want to say somebody flying some eagles.
yeah, falconer over
Yep.
there, and
Yep.
it's like a cute little western scene. Um,
Yeah, it does look very Western. That's a really good way of putting it.
yeah, I don't want to join the chorus of just instant instant knee jerk reactions, but yeah, I can see. I mean, this was even worse than I thought you were saying when you kind of brought it up. I mean, it is making this kind of like, yeah, that's not, my gosh, we could talk, I mean, we could talk a lot about like orc, the half orc in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons comes from a rather,
Racist place.
well, sure. I was going to say, the background is usually dark, right? Without saying, without getting ourselves in
Yeah,
trouble here. The coupling between an orc and a non-orc is, yeah,
this stuff
problematic
got
to say
real
the least.
fast, Scott.
Sorry. What? But it's in the books. It's in the books, and that was
Yeah.
it was one of the concepts that was kind of contextualized as, right? I mean, being a half orc in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in the '80s was like you're going to be shunned. You're not, orcs are. So
Is
this
that
is.
is that in first edition?
I'm pretty sure. I mean,
You
again,
keep talking. I'll look.
yeah, that's how I certainly remember it in first and second. I definitely first edition, and I don't. Second edition obviously was a little bit friendlier. I can't imagine because obviously second edition had that reaction uh,
Couldn't even have the
to the
assassin.
satanic panic, and not
Half
we had.
orcs.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. There
17.
are no half orcs in second edition, right? So they didn't have to worry about that at all. They
Yeah.
completely removed it. I forgot that for a second. But I'm pretty sure in the first edition, it's probably not in the basic set, which is where I came from it. But I do remember reading and being like, wow, this is rough. If you're playing a half orc, your lineage is not a happy one.
Can I read the half orc description from the first edition PHP?
S'il vous plaît.
Okay. So after half elves and halflings, we get half orcs. Orcs are fecund and create many crossbreeds, most of the offspring of such being typically orcish. However, some 1/10 of orc human mongrels are sufficiently
Oh,
non-orcish to pass for human. Complete details of orcs and crossbreeds will be found under the heading Orc in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual. There's a typo in this. Mine says Advanced Dungeons featuring dragons, comma, Monster Manual. As it is assumed that player characters are of half orc as it is assumed that player characters which are of half orc race are within the superior 10%, they have certain advantages. A half orc character can become a cleric, maximum of 4th level, a fighter, maximum of 10th level, a thief, maximum of 8th level, or an assassin. It is also possible for a half orc character to operate in 2 classes at the same time: cleric slash fighter, cleric slash thief, cleric slash assassin, fighter slash thief, or fighter slash assassin. When playing a multi-classed character, the half orc must abide by the restrictions of the least favorable class with regard to armor. All earned experience is always divided equally between the player's 2 classes, even though the character might no longer be able to progress upwards in level in one of the 2 classes. See character classes for more information. Half orc characters are able to speak the quote common tongue unquote of humanity, their alignment language, and orcish as well. These characters are able to learn a maximum of 2 additional languages. Half orcs have infravision, so that they can detect varying degrees of heat radiation up to 60 feet distant in the dark. As has been shown before, half orc characters have bonuses of +1 to both their strength and constitution scores initially rolled, but they must subtract a charisma penalty of -2. Note that this penalty is in regard to those non-player character henchmen who are not themselves of half-orc race, so the initial unaltered charisma ability score should be recorded CF dwarves. And I take it that people would want to be half-orcs for that constitution and strength bonus. Let's see here.
and do you mind if I set the Wayback Machine to page 16 of that was from the Player's Handbook, correct?
That was from the Player's Handbook, yeah.
Interesting, by the way. It's interesting because I think you remember, like I do, reading somewhere in these books about how, again, that the lineage is not particularly non-problematic. But I would like to read the half-orc section from the Advanced D&D guide, which we have read before, but it's interesting to revisit
Wait,
now.
this is the DMG?
Yeah,
Oh,
do you mind?
do it. Let's hear it.
Yeah. Half-orcs are boors. They are rude, crude, crass, and generally obnoxious. Because most are cowardly, they tend to be bullies and cruel to the weak, but they will quickly knuckle under to the stronger. This does not mean that all half-orcs are horrid, only most of them. It neither means that they are necessarily stupid nor incapable. They will always seek to gain the upper hand and dominate those around them so as to be able to exercise their natural tendencies. Half-orcs are greedy too. They can, of course, favor their human parent more than their orcish one, which I find interesting. Again, one thing we can say I think with some certainty is that the boundaries for playing specific ancestries or classes back in the day was much more narrower, right? You were expected to kind of I mean, I could say you could expect it, but I feel like every game I ever played, we always kind of, played with those boundaries rather liberally, pun intended there. Um, but it still was like, okay, this is what your like you have a much larger influence from your DNA than I think in modern D&D where
Yeah,
it's
I
like
mean,
you can go
again,
anywhere.
like if I don't want to beat a dead horse here because I feel like we
Hmm.
spent like the entire last episode
Yeah.
talking about this and feel like we
Yeah.
covered it before. But again, it's just it comes from a pretty obviously prejudiced place, which is I don't know, like it was the '70s in Wisconsin, and Gary Gygax was middle aged when this was all going on, which is not to say that he couldn't have been better, but
Well, this is a world. Like, one thing you can say is obviously this is the world that Gary Gygax was kind of building, or at least trying to, kind of infer that your game was going to be played in, was one that did have a much more of a kind of, I mean, I almost, black and white balance to the world, right? There are literally are creatures that are completely evil. We did mention this in the last session. I
yeah,
mentioned, the caves of chaos situation where everybody runs into, where there's like young, and it's funny. Of course, I'm completely thinking about that because I'm looking at this D&D orc image from the books, and yeah, I'm not a fan of this. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of like it seems weird. I'm having a hard time not being like, this is literally meant to get people upset, and it's not getting me upset, but it's not necessarily the definition of how I would see an orc. I mean, orcs have been classically from the 1970s in the OSR community. These things are unrepentant monsters. We talked about this last session.
yeah.
These are the monsters. These are the monsters from you see from the Lord of the Rings, right? They're they're unrepentantly evil. They have literally been born from, basically mangling magic into something, profane, right? And the orcs in this image, of course, it's like this happy family. It literally looks like this is the orc sitcom that we're about to watch. This is the Brady Bunch of orcs in this picture. I kid you not. Which is interesting. It's not my cup of tea. I don't have a problem with it, and I do think it's interesting, and I think it probably ties into the fact that if you can play a half orc, you're going to want to. These are straight orcs, though. These aren't even like half orcs, which is interesting. So I guess orcs in modern D&D, and oh my gosh, this is interesting. So these are orcs look like in Greyhawk. I don't think Gary would be pleased, but what
I
can you
mean, you know, we talked last week about some of the racism in the
Yeah.
DNA of
Hmm.
fantasy, and it certainly seems like D&D is attempting to push past it. Because one of the things I do think people want is I think people actually do want to play orcs.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I would agree that that does seem cool to me. Uh, but again, when the core idea of the orc at one point was the darker skinned other,
Yeah. Yeah.
and where do you go from there? I also want to say Bruce Nesmith, designer of Skyrim and creator of the Ravenloft box set with
Hmm.
oh, I can't, what's the woman's name? Why can't I remember her name? Andrea Hayday. Um, and I love Ravenloft. When I interviewed him, he kind of casually threw out at one point that in the 1990s, fantasy was really two things. It was Tolkien and all of his descendants, and Dungeons and Dragons. And those were the core ideas of fantasy in the modern consciousness. So for D&D to try to scrub uh these kind of racist tropes out of the genre from a historical perspective is just interesting. Um, and we'll have to see how it goes, and hopefully it goes well. And it does seem to be a bunch of people our age who had this idea of, well, all the stormtroopers are bad, just
Hmm.
shoved into our brains very early on, competing with the J.J. Abrams idea from The Force Awakens of actually all of these stormtroopers are kidnapped children. They're essentially child soldiers that have histories and backgrounds, and you should feel bad about killing them until the third movie when we're just going to kill them at wholesale. So again, like actually, Star Wars does present a really interesting contrast here, where in The Force Awakens, again, J.J. Abrams was like, stormtroopers are people too, and yet in the next two movies they still just kill him all the time. It's like, don't, that's not a real person, you don't need to worry about it. Just kill them, and you can be excited about killing them because they're just pure evil in white armor. um and maybe that is the issue, is that, like, if you want to tell a story about good and evil, you need to have your evil.
Hmm.
And it is easier just to be like, well, this entire category is evil, so just move on with your day. Um,
Wow, it's interesting. I mean, you're hitting a nerve just because I've been thinking about this. I'm thinking exactly about what you're talking about. And like, the Acolyte television show for Star Wars has just come out, and I haven't watched it, but I've read a little bit about it. I'm so behind in my Star Wars television, and I don't know if I'm going to catch up because I don't know if I care that much, to be honest.
yeah,
But one of the things that I think is interesting is I've been thinking a lot around, A New Hope, which is my favorite movie of all time. There's nothing A New Hope means so much to me. From when I saw it to how kind of meaningful it is, and Luke Skywalker is still one of my favorite. Well, Obi-Wan Kenobi is actually even more favorite character of mine in fiction, but I digress. It's interesting. One of the things I keep thinking about is how every Star Wars seems to get it wrong to what I really loved about it. And I don't know, maybe this is problematic, but I love that it's a fable. Like, I love that it's a fairy tale. I love that it kind of exists in that world. And it's interesting because we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, and how the imposition of the concept of this is a world that is more grayer or grayer, hawkier. Anyway, you get my point. A little bit more grayer than a necessarily black and white world. But one of the things that always drew me to A New Hope and drew me to those things, and sometimes maybe even draws me to some of the early fantasy fiction, is the concept of a black and white world. And I don't know if it's, and I think there's something to be said for, we can all understand that that's not what the real world is, right? That we don't have to say that if we dwell within a fantasy world of contextualization, it certainly reveals things. It reveals, I think, interesting desires, and it reveals maybe our own comfortability with how not black and white the world is, about how there are so many shades of gray. Morality is extremely subjective. Situational ethics all over the place, guide our lives. It really depends. So many things in life depend upon a certain point of view, if I might quote Obi-Wan Kenobi. And these worlds, and I know that this is a defense from folks that I don't always agree with, against kind of modern renditions of Dungeons and Dragons, or Dungeons and Dragons making necessarily critiques of the modern world, is that one of the knee-jerk reactions is like, this is a fake world. It's just somewhere. It doesn't really exist. We don't have to worry about it. It is, as always, as folks like to say, it is just a game. And it is never just a game. As I would say, we live in a completely, a radical, basically we live in a radical imposition of millions of magic circles around us. We're constantly playing different games all the time. But there is something to be said for, I like the concept that people can contextualize, that we can play in worlds that may not look like ours, that we, just what you said, sometimes maybe in our deepest fantasy, we need the comfort of black and white, of easier moralities, or I don't know, and I don't even know if that's
well,
not problematic.
I mean, here's what I would say. I would say that in Little Red Riding Hood, the minute the wolf walks on stage, you're like, oh, he's bad because he's the wolf.
What? I always thought the grandma was the villain in that story.
No. It's the wolf.
I know.
And there is a way of playing D&D akin to that, where it's
Right.
like, you just want to see the wolf. However, that and that coding is very childish, right? Like, it's very, very simple morality. And adulthood in many ways is moving past it and realizing complexity, which is of course difficult and uncomfortable. And
Sure. Yep.
D&D is also simultaneously a hobby caught between, this is for 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
And
yes.
Actually, no, we're going to get adults playing in funny voices and telling stories. So again, I think this is there are complexities here, even though at the same time you're like, well, you don't want racist stereotypes and tropes just kind of running around, your game, probably.
Well, just reading those two sections, you can see, I mean, there's like a weird eugenics philosophy to some of the stuff in old D&D that makes us feel slightly uncomfortable. And I think that it should make us feel uncomfortable. I also think there's some argument to be made for the contextualization of like, okay, I don't think we should necessarily, I always find it interesting because I think artists as a generally should feel kind of free to kind of, like express kind of what they're saying. But there has to be some reflection on artists to be like, wow, this is the way that I kind of view that. That's what I think is so, I think, terrifying around folks that are designers or artists or writers, like with the things that you reveal around the things that often come through your art about how you actually view the world can often be terrifying, because you're like, oh my gosh, this is what I really think about this world, you know? So that's why I think art in many ways involves a fearlessness that in many ways I don't possess. I thought there was one last comment that I think is so interesting because, again, you keep touching on things that have been going through my head recently, but your comment around who plays Dungeons and Dragons, or I find it so interesting that I jumped on this podcast and I'm currently barbecuing right now for my Strahd group tonight. I'm making a brisket, and I'm in the middle of the barbecue. I'm thinking about how strange it is that I'm having, and everybody in my Strahd group is, but it's an older group, right? And it's is when did Dungeons and Dragons shift? Like in the 1980s, how many people? So I'm 50 years old. How many people at 50 were playing Dungeons and Dragons? I suppose Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, a lot of those folks in his group, but the game was being sold and created mostly for adolescents. But now it's a game that, and I think it's so interesting, like you pointing out that you make funny voices, and you do, like, I've said this before, I think Dungeons and Dragons is often one of the most intimate things you can do. I DM, and I'm like, the anxiety that runs through me when I'm DMing, because like you have to manage so many different things at one time. But when did DM kind of like, when did D&D or tabletop role-playing games become like socially acceptable for, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this, but at some point it became okay to play in as an adult, or even expected to play as an adult. Like, when did D&D shift to a much larger range of an audience?
2017.
Sure, like it was 3 o'clock in 2016 when I don't know, but it is interesting. I was like, the question I asked myself as I was putting the smoker together was like, did I think when I was 13 years old that I would still be playing Dungeons and Dragons at 50?
It's funny.
And
When I was 13 years old, I was like, keep buying X-Men comics.
Mhm.
I kept buying X-Men comics for like another 6 months after I made that promise to myself. Chris Claremont left, so what are you gonna do? Um, but
Yeah.
like, I'm gonna say it was for me. It was in high school that I was like, oh, this is a forever hobby.
Hmm.
Um, and I think I've mentioned this in the past week, but again, I'm finishing up writing a novel right now, and it's remarkable to me how much the emotions of writing and the joy of writing mirror the joys of a good role-playing game campaign.
Right. Yep.
So again, I can certainly see why it's so addictive. You keep chasing that high. Um, and I guess just to bookend this, because I certainly wasn't planning on spending like 2 episodes in a row
Yeah.
discussing troubling tropes in D&D. But hey, if we're gonna read this stuff, and we got to be honest about it.
Yeah.
Again, I would agree with you that the biggest, most troubling things in the characterization of the half orc that we read are based on who your parents are, we can know these things about you. Like, that is the core thing.
Yeah.
And that art seems to be explicitly escaping it in being like, hey, you can be an orc and you can be a falconer.
Yeah.
You can be an orc and you can be this. And I think that from a, like, you would want to think of people, hey, your parents could be anybody and you can be anybody, and who your parents are should not impact who I think you are.
Hmm.
And there is the loss of an easy villain in that, but hopefully it's positioning us for greater growth. Like, and it is moving D&D into a more adult place for more adult play. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think that I can close on.
Well, there's no, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact this image, it has it has a rhetorical purpose, right? I'm a big fan of kind of what you just said, which is the concept that you shouldn't necessarily be bounded by ancestral requirement. It's funny, we can talk about limitations on, how far you can go at different classes as well, which again is a type of limitation for these demi-human classes, which was more of a ludic limitation necessarily than an aesthetic one. But I think this is I was going to use the term salvo, but that sounds more violent than I meant it to sound. But this is definitely I can't think that this is absolutely a conscious decision on Wizards of the Coast to make the art. It's in many ways very, very much have that rhetorical purpose. Like this is an argument that they're making to say this D&D 2024 is definitely not just passively resisting that concept, but it's going to actively resist that concept. You can be anything. You can be both a falconer or a happy kid as an orc. But yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely a change.
All right.
Should we read spells now? Roll for digression, right?
Yeah, yeah. All right. Let us get through one spell. My suggestion is actually going to be I'm going to read. I think the first spell in the DMG with notes is detect evil.
Yeah, cleric spells, first level spells, detect evil. Oh, is that? Oh, you're saying from the player's handbook?
No, from the DMG, but
Yeah,
I was going to read the description from the player's handbook first, just so we can see how because theoretically the player is supposed to have this open, the DM is supposed to have that open, and for at least the first spell, let's try this. And if this is weird, we just won't do it again. So this is from page 44 of the first edition player's handbook. Detect evil. Divination, reversible, level 1, range 12 feet, duration 1 turn plus a half turn per level, area of effect. Wow, okay. This says a 1-inch path is the area of effect. That seems a little narrow for me.
Well, yeah.
Components are VSM, so I think that's verbal, somatic, and
material.
Yep. Casting time 1 round, saving throw none. Explanation/description. This is a spell which discovers emanations of evil or of good in the case of the reverse spell from any creature or object. For example, evil alignment or an evilly cursed object will radiate evil, but a hidden trap or an unintelligent viper will not. The duration of a detect evil or detect good spell is 1 turn plus a half turn, 5 rounds, or 5 minutes per level of the cleric. Thus, a cleric of first level of experience can cast a spell with a 1.5 turn duration, at second level a 2 turn duration, 2.5 at third, etc. The spell has a path detection 1 inch wide in the direction in which the cleric is facing. It requires the use of the cleric's holy or unholy symbol as its material component, with the cleric holding it before him or her. And in the Dungeon Master's Guide...
And by the way, when it says 1 inch, they're talking about war game table lengths, because that's one of the things that's really confusing around all of the one of the nice things that I mentioned before, that when I run first edition AD&D, I have to use Osric because I don't have the AD&D still has that holdover about sand table wargaming, and the concept of these distances are going to be measured how a ruler would measure that you've got the miniatures on the sand table, right? And I'm not smart enough to be able to quickly be like, 1 inch equals 10 feet or whatever it is. It'd be interesting to note when that change happened as well with Dungeons and Dragons, when it moved from doing the inches of a ruler on a sand table to saying what it actually exists in diegetically, what it actually exists in the actual world that you're playing in.
Take a shot. You said diegetic. All right.
Yeah.
So, Gary says about this, detect evil. Basically, the degree of evil, faint, moderate, strong, overwhelming, and its general nature, expectant, malignant, gloating, etc., can be noted. If the evil is overwhelming, the general bent, lawful, neutral, chaotic, has a 10% chance per level of the cleric of being detectable. That is... My God. That is really weird. So you really can't correctly use Detect Evil in first edition AD&D without both of these books open at the same time, reading the text.
Well, I don't, we never played with having the DM's guide
Yeah.
open. I mean, it was always there. I'm actually confused by what that means. And I know that our listeners are much smarter than me. So like somebody
Okay, I
could,
think I get it. So let me see if I
yeah.
can. So what he's saying there is, if the evil is overwhelming, so again he divides it into these degrees.
Mhm.
You have a 10% chance
Oh,
of figuring out if it's lawful, neutral, or chaotic, which is
oh,
very a
got it.
little
Got
weird
it.
to me, but
Yeah.
okay. Um, Again,
What
the thing
kind
I
of
really go ahead.
Yeah. What kind of evil wouldn't be? Oh, I get it. Okay, so you could tell the difference, for instance, between a devil and a demon if you've got a 10% chance, because that sounds really fun for somebody to have to roll. The DM has to roll a percentage to figure that out. Yeah, okay, so that makes sense. So you're gonna know that evil is out there, but you've only got a 10% chance of knowing whether it's lawful, neutral, or chaotic. It's going to be evil, but you don't necessarily know the flavor of that evil
Yeah.
unless you roll a 10% chance. Okay, that makes sense.
All right. So, I would close with this question, which is there's a lot of notes on spells coming up the next few pages, and if we if we read every spell and every note on the spell, that will take a few months. But so let us know what you think of that, listeners. Because again, we obviously want to make a show that you're interested in. Some of you might be like, yes, read every spell from the player's handbook and its notation from the Dungeon Master's Guide. Because I will say, reading just that note without the player's handbook description does seem to me to be somewhat insufficient, but reading all of the spells with their notes also seems like it would be, again, the work of months. Scott, you think about what you think. Audience,
Yeah.
let us know on Discord and social media, which I'm terrible about checking. But get back to us. I'll be at Gen Con giving presentations. I will also be in the Writers Symposium there if you're interested. We'll be at Gamehole Con. I'll be at WindyCon and the Philadelphia Area Gaming Exposition. And if you haven't purchased my book, again, we're almost out of hardcovers, so I would encourage you to purchase a hardcover while you can. Scott, what do you want to go ahead and say something about your brisket?
Well, oh yeah. Well, it's we were following Aaron Franklin's recipe from what I don't even know what the name of his place in Austin, Texas is. But yeah, the brisket's gonna be fantastic. But all you need is to put salt and pepper on your brisket. Don't go crazy with fancy rubs, folks. But those of you who do want to pipe in about what you think we should be covered on this, how do you get access to the Discord? You say, well, you have to give us $3 a month. Yeah, so we have a Patreon. And by the way, if I might do a little of foreshadowing, there are going to be some changes to the Patreon coming up, because I think we're trying to shoot for a hard launch. We've been soft launching all of these. If you haven't noticed, that all of these episodes have been soft and squishy because we've never done the hard launch yet. But July 15th there'll be some changes to Patreon. There'll be new things that you will be able to have access to. But right now, $3 grants you access to our Discord channel, where we have a fantastic. It's just so much fun to listen to folks talk about some of the topics that we bring up. But to get access to Discord is $3 a month on our Patreon, which of course Benny will put links towards.
Indeed.
And yeah, there's going to be some changes coming up as well, and I'm very much looking forward to. I didn't realize that Gamehole wasn't until October, but I'm excited to be there for that as well. Mostly though, I think I'm going to be barbecuing this summer and watching baseball.
All right. Well, Scott, you have a nice Sunday. Listeners, you have a nice Sunday, and we'll talk later.
Sounds good.
Bye bye.